There's some names in music history that don't just belong to the people who carry them. They belong to the world. Bob Marley is one of those names. For decades, he has existed not merely as a musician or a man, but as a symbol, a towering, almost mythological figure draped in the colors of peace, resistance, and spiritual liberation. His face appears on walls in neighborhoods from Kingston to Kampala. His music plays at weddings, at protests, at funerals, at beach bars, and in the earbuds of teenagers who weren't born until 20 years after he died. The world claims Bob Marley. The world loves Bob Marley. But there is one person who knew Bob Marley not as a symbol, not as a prophet, not as a Grammy-winning reggae icon, but as a father. And for a very long time, that person said almost nothing. His name is Ziggy Marley. And when he finally decided to speak, what came out wasn't a polished tribute. It wasn't a carefully managed PR statement designed to protect a billion-dollar legacy. What came out was the truth. Raw, complicated, and in many ways deeply painful. The kind of truth that changes how you see someone, not by tearing them down, but by making them human again. This is the story of what Ziggy revealed, and why it matters more than almost anything else said about Bob Marley in the past 40 years. To understand what Ziggy Marley has shared in recent years, you first have to understand the impossible circumstances he grew up in. He was born David Nesta Marley in 1968, the first child of Bob and Rita Marley. By the time he was old enough to have memories, his father was already transforming into something larger than any single household could contain. Bob Marley wasn't just a musician by the mid-1970s. He was a movement. An entire generation of people across the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and North America were pressing their ears against radios and turntables, listening to a man from Trenchtown tell them something true about suffering and hope. And that man was Ziggy's father. You might think that would feel extraordinary, and in some ways, perhaps it did. But what Ziggy has described in interviews over the years paints a picture that is far more complex than the glossy mythology would suggest. Bob Marley was consumed, genuinely and completely consumed, by his music, his message, and the global demand placed upon him. That level of devotion to a cause, however noble, leaves very little room for the ordinary rhythms of fatherhood. The school pickups, the bedtime stories, the Saturday mornings that have no agenda except being together. Those things require presence. And presence was what Bob Marley found most difficult to give. Ziggy has spoken carefully but honestly about this reality. His father was often absent. When Bob was home, he wasn't always there, not emotionally, not fully. His mind lived in the music, in the politics of Jamaica, in the weight of a message he seemed to genuinely believe he was chosen to carry. Ziggy grew up understanding, even as a small child, that he was sharing his father not just with a family, but with the entire world. And the world, as it turned out, was a very demanding rival for a father's attention. What makes Ziggy's account so affecting is the absence of self-pity in it. He doesn't perform grief for an audience. He speaks plainly, almost with the measured tone of a man who has spent decades sorting through complicated feelings and arrived somewhere just short of peace. He loved his father. He admires what his father built. He has spent his life honoring that legacy. And yet, underneath all of that, there's a quiet ache, the ache of a boy who needed a father and often found instead an icon. If there is a single moment that crystallized for Ziggy just how dangerous and destabilizing his childhood truly was, it was the evening of December 3rd, 1976. Ziggy was 8 years old. Jamaica was in the grip of intense political violence, and Bob Marley had agreed to perform at the Smile Jamaica concert, a free outdoor event designed to ease the tensions between warring political factions. It was a brave and characteristically bold decision. It was also one that made him a target. That evening, gunmen entered the family compound at 56 Hope Road in Kingston. Bob was shot in the chest and arm during rehearsal. Rita Marley was shot in the head. Their manager, Don Taylor, was also wounded. The attack was brutal, sudden, and terrifying in its precision. It was not a random act of crime. It was a politically motivated assassination attempt against a man whose voice had become powerful enough to threaten forces far beyond the music industry. For the rest of the world, this story was eventually filed away as one of the more dramatic chapters in rock and roll history. A near miss, a moment of defiance. The legendary image of Bob performing 2 days later with a wound still fresh, pointing toward the sky. It became mythology almost immediately. For 8-year-old Ziggy, it was something else entirely. He has described being pulled from his bed that night in a state of chaos and confusion, rushed by police to a safe location in the hills, not knowing if his parents were alive. The sounds, the fear, the sheer incomprehensibility of what was happening, none of that gets filed away neatly in the mind of a child. It lodges somewhere deep and quiet, and it shapes the way a person understands a world for the rest of their life. Ziggy has reflected on that night with striking candor, acknowledging that even in his child's mind, there was something almost surreal about the combination of terror and adrenaline. But the emotional residue of that night, the understanding that the world his father moved through was genuinely dangerous, never left him. The Marley home was not a sanctuary. It was a location on a target, and being born into it meant inheriting that exposure without ever having chosen it. Perhaps the most striking thing Ziggy has said publicly about his father concerns not the icon, but the man, the private Bob Marley. The Bob Marley who existed before the cameras turned on and after they went off. And the portrait Ziggy paints is, to say the least, more complicated than the posters on dormitory walls suggest. Bob Marley had what Ziggy has described as violent tendencies. He was a fighter, shaped by trenchdown, hardened by a childhood of poverty and social exclusion, and carrying within him a kind of raw, unresolved fury that his music only partially metabolized. His nickname in the streets wasn't handed to him as a marketing device. Tough Gone was earned. It reflected something real about who he was before the world crowned him a prophet of peace. That inner tension between the man who wrote about love and unity and the man who carried deep anger and unresolved pain created contradictions that played out at home in ways that confused and sometimes frightened the people closest to him. Ziggy doesn't describe this to diminish his father. He describes it because he believes it's necessary for the world to understand the full cost of what Bob Marley gave. The peace Bob projected outward was something he wrestled to maintain inwardly. His art was not the easy expression of a naturally serene soul. It was the hard-won output of someone fighting their own darkness every day. Bob also found release in physicality in a way that surprised many who knew him only through his music. He was, according to Ziggy, almost fanatical about football and boxing. Not as hobbies, not as casual recreation, but as something closer to necessity. He played with an intensity that mirrored everything else he did, competitive, driven, needing to win. Ziggy recalls Bob showing up at his school not to stand on the sidelines and watch, but to lace up his boots and get on the pitch himself, playing hard against children half his age without pulling back. Looking back, Ziggy understands this differently now than he did as a boy. The physical exertion was a form of emotional regulation. Bob Marley had no real mechanism for processing the immense pressure he was under. He couldn't sit quietly with a therapist and unpack his trauma. That simply wasn't available to him, culturally, practically, or perhaps temperamentally. What he had was movement. The football pitch and the boxing mat were the few places where he could exist entirely in his body, where the noise of expectations and politics and the weight of being a global symbol temporarily went silent. For a few hours on a field, Bob Marley was just a man chasing a ball. And those moments, Ziggy has suggested, were as vital to his survival as anything else. Of all the difficult truths Ziggy has shared about his father's private life, the ones concerning Bob and Rita's marriage are among the most emotionally raw. The public narrative of Bob and Rita Marley is one of devotion, a love story woven through some of the most beautiful music ever created. Rita stood by Bob through everything. She sang with him, raised his children, managed the chaos of his life, and remained at his side as he died. That loyalty is real, and Ziggy does not dismiss it. But Ziggy also witnessed the inside of that marriage. And what he saw was not a love story. Or rather, it was a love story of a particular and painful kind. one defined as much by damage as by devotion. Bob was deeply possessive of Rita in ways that bordered on controlling. He was intensely jealous of other men's attention toward her, yet he fathered children with multiple other women throughout their marriage. That contradiction, demanding loyalty while refusing to practice it, created a toxic and deeply unequal dynamic. Rita endured things that no amount of love or loyalty should require a person to endure. And yet she stayed. She stayed out of shared history, out of devotion to something larger than herself, and perhaps out of a sense of duty to the family and the legacy they had built together. Ziggy has spoken about this with a combination of admiration and sorrow. He acknowledges Rita's extraordinary strength. He also cannot pretend he didn't see what that strength cost her. He has used striking language to describe the emotional damage inflicted within the marriage. Language that makes clear he believes both his parents carried wounds that never fully healed, wounds they sometimes inflicted on each other. Their bond endured not because it was healthy, but because it was too deeply entwined with everything they had both built and sacrificed to simply walk away from. For Ziggy, growing up inside that marriage meant watching love and pain exist in the same space simultaneously. It meant learning early that the people capable of creating the most beautiful things are not always the people most capable of protecting each other. After the 1976 assassination attempt, Bob left Jamaica. He relocated to London, where he found both physical safety and creative inspiration. The London period was extraordinarily productive. He wrote and recorded some of the most important music of his career, including the album Exodus, later named by Time magazine as the greatest album of the 20th century. The world gained enormously from those years. Ziggy stayed behind in Jamaica. He was a child, still processing the trauma of having witnessed his parents nearly killed. He was attending school, trying to navigate a routine, trying to make sense of the violence and the sudden absence of his father. And while Bob was in London studios creating masterpieces, Ziggy was in Kingston growing up faster than any child should have to. Ziggy has reflected on this period without